The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick Robinson parked his car in the lot outside the municipal courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The warm morning sunlight cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Kendrick exhaled deeply. He hated being late as a federal prosecutor. His professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness. But today, life had conspired against him. This wasn't supposed to be a complicated morning. The task ahead was mundane, challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother left him. The city had raised the taxes inexplicably, and Kendrick had spent weeks gathering proof that it was a mistake. The house was more than property to him. It was the anchor of his childhood, the place where he had learned right from wrong under his grandmother's watchful eye. Dressed in a dark navy suit with a crisp white shirt, Kendrick looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was. Even if his morning had been far from smooth, an urgent phone call about an ongoing human trafficking case had delayed him. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Kendrick couldn't ignore it. He had reviewed the motion and provided feedback to his team before rushing to court knowing he was cutting it close. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance showed a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Kendrick sighed, tucking his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried facts were his weapon, and he came armed with evidence. But something in the message lingered. He shook it off as he stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. The municipal court wasn't like the federal courts where Kendrick spent most of his days. The walls were a dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, despite its worn appearance. The place buzzed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents. Faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and other small claims. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50 a.m., 10 minutes to spare, barely enough time to find the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing people, speaking in hushed tones. Room 204, Judge Charles Whitman was etched in brass on the door. Kendrick adjusted his tie and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling with people. Kendrick found a spot near the back and sat down, flipping open his folder to review his evidence. As he scanned his notes, he noticed the judge entering the room. Judge Charles Whitman, a tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, commanded attention without saying a word. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way he scanned the room. His sharp gaze missing nothing. All rise. The bailiff announced. The room shuffled to its feet. Kendrick joined in, his posture straight as the judge settled into his chair. Kendrick noticed the stark silence that followed. Judge Whitman began calling cases one by one with mechanical efficiency, his tone crisp and detached. Kendrick watched closely. A middle-aged man in a suit, arriving a few minutes late, shuffled into the room. Unnoticed, moments later, a young woman in casual clothes slipped in and took a seat. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Kendrick made a mental note, but focused on his own case. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., Kendrick heard his name called. He gathered his folder and made his way to the podium, projecting calm. Despite the slight delay as he approached, Judge Whitman looked up, his expression hardening. Kendrick felt the shift in the room, a quiet tension that hadn't been present for the previous cases. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Kendrick raised his hand slightly, palms out in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Kendrick felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He maintained his composure, choosing his next words carefully. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Judge Whitman waved a hand dismissively. "We'll get to that first. There's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air like a hammer striking an anvil. Kendrick's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral around him. Murmurs rippled through the room. "Your Honor," Kendrick began, his tone calm and measured. "May I explain?" The judge raised his gavel, silencing him. "You may not consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Kendrick stepped back. His mind racing. This wasn't just about Tar. Dinus, it was about something deeper. Something that many in the room had likely seen before. He glanced briefly at the other latecomers, none of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring, and Kendrick wasn't about to let it slide. As he returned to his seat, Kendrick opened his folder, but this time it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on. He began jotting notes, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The judge, meanwhile, continued with the next case, his voice unwavering. Kendrick knew one thing for certain: this was no ordinary morning. Kendrick sat in the back row, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and observations. The courtroom proceeded in its rhythm, but Kendrick couldn't shake the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. He replayed the moment Judge Whitman imposed the $750 fine, contrasting it with the indifference shown to others who had arrived late. The young woman who had slipped in earlier sat near the front scrolling on her phone, untouched by reprimand. A man in a gray blazer now presenting his case had clearly walked in after the judge began. Yet the gavel's ire had been reserved solely for Kendrick. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern Kendrick could recognize as plainly as the documents in his briefcase. He turned to his legal instincts, assessing the situation with precision. A fine this steep for tardiness in municipal court was extreme, even punitive. He noted the expressions of those around him, a mix of disbelief, discomfort, and curiosity. Kendrick could tell that others in the room were thinking the same thing, but no one dared to speak next. Case Judge Whitman announced. Kendrick's name echoed in the room again. He stood his stride, calm and deliberate. As he returned to the podium, the judge fixed him with the same piercing gaze as if daring him to falter. Kendrick began. Your Honor, I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. The property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments do not align with the city's assessed values. He placed the folder on the podium, opening it to reveal neatly organized documents and photographs. He gestured toward a specific page. This shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment, however, reflects a 30% increase without proper notification or explanation. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of disinterest. I'll review it in due time, Mr. Robinson. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe that the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court? Kendrick's composure remained intact, Your Honor. I mean, no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we all agree requires immediate attention. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone didn't waver. Your priorities, however, noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason. It wasn't the words themselves that struck Kendrick. It was the unspoken tone of dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't good enough. His professional achievements, his character, even his effort to respect the system, none of it mattered in this room. Kendrick took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? A ripple of unease passed through the room. The judge stiffened, the color in his face deepening. Are you questioning the integrity of this court? Mr. Robinson, I'm asking for clarity, Kendrick replied, his tone even. It's important to ensure that fairness is upheld, not just for myself, but for everyone here. The judge's gavel came down sharply. I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands. Kendrick inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. He could sense the quiet admiration of some and the trepidation of others. This wasn't the first time Kendrick had encountered bias cloaked in authority, but something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for what he would do next. Kendrick pulled out his phone, discreetly typing notes. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. He made a quiet decision. Then and there, this situation wouldn't end here. The courtroom continued its routine, but Kendrick's presence had already shifted the atmosphere. Others noticed it too. An older black man sitting 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering Kendrick a brief knowing glance. The court clerk, her fingers flying over the keyboard, occasionally hesitated, her discomfort visible when the session ended. Kendrick lingered for a moment as people filed out. He observed the way they carried the unspoken weight of what had transpired. A young law student sitting in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook. Her expression one. Of awe and determination, Kendrick left the courtroom with his briefcase in hand, his thoughts already forming a plan. This was no longer about a property tax adjustment or even the fine. This was about something much larger, something he couldn't ignore. As Kendrick exited the courtroom, the crisp air outside offered no relief from the tension that still clung to him. The courthouse buzzed with the mundane movements of everyday proceedings. But inside Kendrick's mind, a decision was solidifying. He paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant U.S. attorney. Back at the office, no. He muttered to himself. Not yet. He stepped aside to review his notes again. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Whitman's courtroom painted a clear picture. The disparity wasn't incidental, it was structural. Kendrick's legal instincts told him he now had the seeds of a much larger case, one that went beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment back in his car. Kendrick opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The federal prosecutor's emblem embossed in gold reflected the sunlight streaming through his windshield. He decided this would be the first move by the time he re-entered the courtroom. Most of the morning cases had concluded. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers remained flipping through papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Whitman was leafing through documents, his demeanor calm but visibly tired. Kendrick walked confidently toward the bench, his badge and identification in hand. As he approached the podium, the court clerk raised her eyes, her fingers pausing mid-type. Judge Whitman glanced up, his irritation returning almost instantly. Mr. Robinson, the court session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment, the judge said curtly. With respect, Your Honor. Kendrick began, his voice carrying a quiet authority. I believe it's important to formally introduce myself. He held his badge up slightly, making sure it was clearly visible to everyone in the room. I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases of human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. The judge froze, his hands stilling over the papers he was handling. The color drained from his face as Kendrick's words registered around the room. The remaining spectators watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. I was late this morning because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention. Kendrick continued, his tone firm but respectful. And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Robinson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. I've already begun documenting the events of this morning, Kendrick replied, holding up his notebook. Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, clearly uneasy. Are you accusing this court of misconduct? Mr. Robinson, I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor, Kendrick said calmly. As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied, equally regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns. The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Kendrick and the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was furiously jotting notes, her eyes wide with fascination. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels. Kendrick placed his badge and identification on the podium. I intend to, Your Honor, but I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom. Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He had presided over this courtroom for decades. His authority rarely questioned so directly. For the first time, it seemed, his confidence faltered. You may go, Mr. Robinson, the judge said, his voice quieter now. Kendrick collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not before offering one final statement. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly. As Kendrick walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he felt the eyes of every remaining spectator on his back. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that too often failed to see its own flaws. Outside, Kendrick pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed email to his office. He included every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed by the time he hit send. He knew this was only the beginning. The email Kendrick sent that afternoon moved faster than he anticipated. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. His supervisor, Julia Harper, a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience, spoke with a mix of urgency and intrigue. "Kendrick, I read your report." She said, "If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just a one-off situation. This could indicate systemic bias." "I believe it does," Kendrick replied. "What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before, and I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it." Julia exhaled sharply. "I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately but thoroughly in the meantime. Gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready." The call ended, but Kendrick's work was just beginning. He spent hours piecing together every detail from the municipal court session. He combed through public records, noting inconsistencies in fines and penalties issued by Judge Whitman. Patterns began to emerge. Fines for minor infractions were significantly higher for black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced penalties. Kendrick reached out to colleagues and community members, including attorneys, who had appeared in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming stories of desperate treatment, flooded in some whispered in confidence, others offered with bold defiance. A young black woman recounted being fined heavily for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses received only a small fee. Another described how the judge often interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases within days. The Judicial Review Commission initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators descended on the courthouse, requesting years of case records and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, proved to be a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are notes I've been taking," she confessed every time something didn't sit right. "I wrote it down. I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore." The notes painted a damning picture. Dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment were meticulously recorded. Investigators also spoke with James Wilson, the longtime bailiff in the courtroom. He shared his observations with quiet conviction. "I've been here 15 years. Wilson said, "I've seen how the judge treats people differently, depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do." Meanwhile, the story began to leak into the local community. A young law student who had witnessed the exchange in the courtroom posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it gained traction, sparking outrage and a flood of similar testimonies. The headlines followed soon after: "Bias in Greenville Courtroom. Federal prosecutor challenges judge's conduct." News outlets picked up the story, and Kendrick found himself at the center of a growing storm. Calls from reporters came nonstop, but he chose to remain focused on the investigation. The mounting pressure began to take its toll on Judge Whitman. Rumors circulated that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing privately, he began to realize the gravity of the situation. By the end of the first week, Kendrick received a call from Julia. "The findings so far are staggering," she said. "The numbers don't lie. Kendrick, black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions." "It's systemic. What's the next step?" Kendrick asked. "We're taking this to the state judicial board. And Kendrick, the media is not going to let this go. Be prepared." Kendrick nodded to himself even as a wave of exhaustion hit him. This was bigger than he had imagined, but he had no intention of backing down. The story of Kendrick's encounter with Judge Whitman had spread far beyond Greenville. By the end of the second week, national media outlets picked up the case. Headlines like "Systemic Bias Unveiled," "Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand" dominated the news cycle. Social media hashtags such as #EqualJusticeNow and #bias in the courts trended for days, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of courtroom discrimination. Kendrick remained focused, working with the Judicial Review Commission to consolidate evidence. The findings were devastating. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants an average of 300% more than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals from white defendants often went unmentioned, while black defendants faced reprimands or steep fines. Even requests for leniency, such as payment plans were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The evidence wasn't just statistical, it was deeply human. Former defendants came forward, some publicly, others anonymously, to share their stories. A black mother recounted being fined $500 for contesting a minor zoning issue, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described how the judge had humiliated him in court, questioning his work ethic only to dismiss a similar case from a white defendant. Minutes later, local activist groups joined the fray, organizing rallies and calling for accountability outside the Greenville courthouse. Protesters held signs reading, "Justice should be blind and end bias now." Kendrick avoided the public spectacle as much as possible, but he couldn't ignore the significance of what was unfolding inside the courthouse. The pressure-mounted staff members who had worked under Judge Whitman for years began sharing their own observations. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, became a key figure in the investigation. Her detailed notes combined with court records painted a comprehensive picture of bias that spanned decades. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said during one interview with investigators. "But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." Even James Wilson, the bailiff, spoke up publicly in a statement to the commission. He said, "I've seen this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong, and it's long past time for something to be done." Judge Whitman, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. While he initially dismissed the accusations as misinterpretations, the mounting evidence forced him into damage control. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. The words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof. To the contrary, Kendrick, though inundated with attention, stayed grounded. He continued his work as a federal prosecutor, knowing that his responsibilities extended beyond this case. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the messages pouring into his office. Emails, phone calls, and letters came from across the country, some offering support, others sharing similar stories of bias in other courtrooms. One particularly moving letter came from a retired attorney in Alabama. "For years, I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The movement grew beyond Greenville. Other judges in South Carolina faced scrutiny as activists and reporters began digging into court records. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced a broad review of municipal courts, vowing to root out systemic bias by the end of the month. The Judicial Review Commission completed its preliminary report. The findings were damning, and the implications were clear. Judge Whitman's actions were part of a larger, deeply embedded problem. The report called for immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent oversight committees. The pressure became too much for Judge Whitman, faced with the prospect of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action. He announced his resignation in a brief statement. He said, "I believe it's in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside." The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as an admission of guilt, while others saw it as a necessary step toward healing for Kendrick. It was a moment of vindication, but not celebration. The resignation was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead as reforms began to take shape. Kendrick found himself in a new role. He was invited to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences about his experience and the importance of challenging systemic bias. His story inspired young lawyers, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, to see themselves as agents of change. At one such event, a young black law student approached Kendrick after his speech. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules, it's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, humbled by the words. "The fight is just beginning, but if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after the morning that set everything in motion, the courthouse in Greenville looked markedly different. The tired beige walls were repainted, and a new welcome desk greeted visitors as they entered. Signs in multiple languages directed people to resources they hadn't known were available before: payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. A small but meaningful plaque had been installed near the entrance. "Equal justice is everyone's right inside the courthouse." Changes were even more pronounced. Judge Whitman was no longer presiding, having quietly left the bench following his resignation. In his place, a younger judge with a reputation for fairness and impartiality had taken over. More importantly, systemic reforms were already underway. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training, led by experts who tackled the subtle ways discrimination could seep into decision-making. Kendrick stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the changes that had been implemented as he waited for his turn. He felt a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. Change had begun, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. The reforms extended far beyond Greenville. Inspired by Kendrick's actions, other communities in South Carolina, and eventually across the country, began reevaluating their own court systems. State judicial review boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes with particular attention to racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants were established to monitor court proceedings and ensure accountability in Kendrick's office. The momentum was palpable. His fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand below. It was a photo from a recent event, a group of young law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Kendrick couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds in the community. The ripple effects were equally significant. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had served under Judge Whitman, was now leading bias training sessions for court officers. At one of his sessions, he addressed a room filled with new hires. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he said, "it's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose records had been instrumental in the investigation, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly mentoring younger clerks and ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. Kendrick's influence extended beyond the legal community. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many of whom were inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" She asked. Kendrick thought for a moment before responding. "Listen to each other, to the people who come through our courts, and to those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." The changes weren't without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight, measures claiming they undermined their authority, but the evidence was undeniable. Within a year, the data showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences. In Greenville's municipal court, payment plans were approved more often, and defendants reported feeling treated with more respect. For Kendrick, the most rewarding moments came from the people who approached him to share their stories. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that morning months ago returned to the courthouse to thank him. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said enough. Thank you for giving us hope." One morning, Kendrick received a letter in his office. It was from a young public defender in Chicago who had read about his story and been inspired to start her own investigation into biases in her local courts. The letter ended with a simple but powerful line: "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Kendrick read the letter twice before placing it in a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. It wasn't about him. It never had been. This was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for too long, voices that were finally being heard months later. Kendrick walked back into the courthouse where it had all begun. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center named Impart. After his efforts, as he stepped to the podium, he looked out at the crowd. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and gratitude. "Justice isn't just about laws," Kendrick began. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect, and it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause was thunderous, but Kendrick's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. And he knew that while the work was far from over, this was a step in the right direction.